Chris and Company continues. We roll on with another interview. First off, thank you to the people who were so receptive to last week's interview with Dan Miller. That was one of those, it felt good. It's like I'm going to make a pitching analogy here, which makes sense. We're interviewing the pitching ninja today, but it's like, when you throw a fastball and you just know this one's coming out of the hand, right? That was great. He was so good. And I bring up how we take our broadcasters seriously, but I think that there is something so fun and unique about a guy who has been a part of this journey, who has called an 0-16 team, who is now having his faith and patience be rewarded. He's always been an elite broadcaster. He has always put his best foot forward, even if maybe the organization didn't. And by the time that you are watching this, the Lions have already played their first game of the season. So I'm going to roll the dice, and Austin, you can cut this part out if I'm wrong, and say the Lions defeated the Rams and they are 1-0 to begin the campaign. So that's obviously very exciting. But today we're turning the page back to some baseball content. Rob Friedman, the pitching ninja, is going to be our guest today. I bring it up in the interview, but if you haven't seen the face, you definitely know the Twitter account. You ever seen those GIFs of Tarek Skubal throwing something nasty, or a GIF of Verlander throwing a filthy curveball? He probably posted it. He does a tremendous job of supporting the game, of growing the game, and breaking it down. You've probably seen him on Fox or FanDuel. Really sharp guy. And look, this is one I was looking forward to, because this is an interview show, and I want to get to know my guests, obviously. But when it comes to baseball and somebody who is as sharp a baseball mind as Rob is, that's probably an episode that I could do for like 3 hours. I don't want to hold the guy hostage, so he was kind enough to give me an hour of his time. And let's just jump right into it. But first, if you're watching this on YouTube, hit that like button, hit that subscribe button. We are available on Apple Podcasts. We're available on Spotify. And you know what? Not only is this show available on Apple Podcasts and Spotify and YouTube, so is All Say This. All Say This is going to be our weekly Michigan-based / Detroit-based sports podcast. Episode 1 is already completed, and probably by the time you're listening to this, episode 2 will already be completed. So yeah, the goal right now, the schedule right now, and I talked about this when I recorded the last I'll Say This, is Mondays being I'll Say This, Wednesdays being Chris and Company. And I want the Chris Castellani brand / channel, along with Austin. This is not just my doing anymore, which is a huge relief, because he's added an element to this that I could have never added. But I want there to be a set schedule. One of the things that has made the Tiger videos that I do grow the way they have is the consistency of the uploads. I want to do that with the shows we're doing. We're scheduling out guests, and we will have another guest here for next week that's already scheduled, but we'll talk about that, cross that bridge when we get to it. Let's get to our interview with the pitching ninja, Rob Friedman. Let's do it. All right, Chris and Company rolls on. We got another baseball-centric episode for y'all. This is a very exciting one, because I think that people who have been paying attention to my content for a long time, they know how much we love baseball here. They know how much we love pitching here, and there's probably not a better guest to have right now than the pitching ninja himself. You've probably seen him on Peacock. You've seen him on MLB. You've seen him on FanDuel. You've probably seen him on Fox. I mean, he's really kind of got quite the rap sheet going. Rob Friedman, my apologies, aka the pitching ninja, joins us today. A man with almost 520,000 Twitter followers. I'm very jealous. I'm not gonna lie. I mean, incredible stuff. Very well earned on your part. For people, I guess, who might not know the face or the name, you definitely know the Twitter account, and it's loaded with, I mean, GIF after GIF after GIF of nasty pitch after nasty pitch. I've probably retweeted you a million times. I've probably been sent that GIF of Sister Jean striking out Javi Baez about 8,000 times at this point, which is understandable. Javi Baez has often been the punching bag of much of my criticism as it pertains to the Detroit Tigers. But I love what you do. I always have. And I just kind of want to start with your background here, because you're one of those content creators who I just feel like existed. Like, I don't remember like baseball Twitter without, going back and watching some of those GIFs and checking those out and retweeting them. So I'm just curious, how did it all start for you? Was it just something that began as a hobby, or were you always trying to monetize it?
Oh, I've never tried to monetize it. That was never at all the idea. So I had started out, I was originally a lawyer, then started my own internet software company, and I was there. And my son was growing up, and all the parents started asking me to coach. And I was like, you know what? I don't want to teach what I was taught, because kind of sucked. Like, I wasn't a great player or anything, but I wanted to teach like the latest and greatest stuff. So I just kept learning and pinging folks, trying to ask folks. We were part of a message board back in the day, Let's Talk Pitching, where it's like Kyle Bodie started there of Driveline. Eric Cressy was there a lot. Alan Jaeger was there. Ben Brewster from Tread Athletics. We were all just like starting out and all learning from each other. And then I just started sharing it on social media, just because I knew I wasn't going to coach for forever. And I just wanted to share what I learned to pay the game forward, kind of. And I kept doing it. And then more and more people were watching what I was doing. And it just kept growing. And after a while, I was like, after a number of years, I was like, you know what? I'm going to do this full time, because this is like taking up all my time anyway. So I'd rather be known as Pitching Ninja than Geolocation Ninja, which is what I started a company called Digital Envoy that does geolocation.
What was the first thing you posted that you remember being like, wow, this is really picking up a lot of traction?
I think it was some breakdown of pitchers' mechanics.
Mm-hmm.
It might have been like Randy Johnson or something like that back in the day. And I remember Billy Wagner chiming in going, I said something about Billy Wagner using his lower half better than Randy Johnson did. And he was like, no, Randy uses lower half well. And I showed him that, and they were teammates for a little bit. And he's like, oh, whoa, no, he didn't. You're right. I was like, wow, that's kind of cool. If Billy Wagner, who should be a Hall of Famer, is, asking me questions about stuff. And then it just kept growing from there, like totally organic, nothing intended. As a matter of fact, rarely do I wake up any morning and have anything intended to do. It's all just the flow of the game, and I just have fun with it.
And there is such I think it's like this with all content creators. There's such a randomness to, what people respond to, what people receive positively, what people receive negatively. And one of my favorite things that you do, because I think it's such a great example of just how good pitchers are nowadays, are the overlays. And again, for people who might not know, it's you taking two separate pitches, often a fastball and a breaking ball and a fastball or a changeup, placing them on top of one another and seeing kind of the tunneling action and how, a pitch will be a fastball for 90% of the time it's there and then just dives out as a slider or a changeup. It's why this is my theory, is that strikeouts and how people react to strikeouts are a generational thing. Because when I see a guy chase a pitch out of the zone, it doesn't bother me that much. Whereas like my father will just groan incessantly, where it's like, well, with spin rates being what they are and guys' stuff being as nasty as it is, I mean, like I said, that's a fastball 90% of the way there, and then it just dives or it breaks. Did you honestly invent the overlay content? Because I hadn't seen it or noticed it before you started posting it. Was that your thing?
I kind of popularized it. Somebody had done an overlay of like Yu Darvish's pitches way back when. It was less to show tunneling though. Like I did it purely to show why hitting is so hard and what pitchers are trying to do to hitters. And I've had people say, man, Pitching Ninja is actually a hitters channel, because it creates so many people not complaining about hitters anymore, chasing stuff. You're like, yeah, I can see why he chased it, because he tunneled this with that fastball that he threw. And what you're talking about is exactly right. Like, I think we have more savvy fans, hopefully now. And that is it. Like, I don't like people, these guys, all hitters are better than we could ever be. They're getting paid for what they do. We're sitting at home for a reason. And I just kind of like to show everybody like what a pitcher's trying to do to a hitter and how that messes up hitters. So it's really just trying to show the strategy.
Do you think, and I'm curious about this because I talk about this again, I think it's more of a generational thing. Do you think hitters are better than they've ever been?
I do. It depends what you think about better. Like, I think they're better athletes than they've been. I think that they approach the game, with way more information. Now, do they put the ball in play? Like, I'm sure there are hitters back in the day. I'm sure like Rod Carew or Wade Boggs or whoever, they probably wouldn't strike out a lot now. Tony Gwynn wouldn't strike out a lot now. Would they be as successful as some of these guys that are, going for broke? Probably not. I think there is an aspect of pitching is so good now that you have to swing hit the ball out, because rallies are harder to come by, especially against a good, watching Chris Sale pitch. You're not putting together a ton of hits against him. So you're hoping to get lucky and maybe put a ball out and then, and deal with the strikeouts. I think it's just a different philosophy, but I do think hitters are more athletic.
Yeah, it's tough to break it down because I agree with you where what we value offensively has changed significantly. I mean, I always go back to this, but the movie Moneyball does a very good job of kind of explaining this, where it's like what used to be, which is high average, are you hitting singles, has now been replaced by drawing walks and hitting for power. Like, I think as brilliant as a guy like Tony Gwynn was, he would be valued, but I don't know if he would get the type of attention in the modern age that maybe he got back when he played, just because he didn't have the pop that guys like Soto or Judge had. He'd still be a phenomenal player, but I think comparable to like what Luis Ariz is, where high average, like great. Yeah, they're very comparable.
Yeah. The one thing I wonder though is if you judged him on something else, so say his salary and his worth is being judged by something else, how would he make that adjustment? And would he have more power? Would he swing, maybe hit 310 and hit 15, 20 home runs? I don't know. Like that's one of those things. It's always an open question. Like, what would Babe Ruth do? Well, if Babe Ruth was just plopped in the middle of a game today, he would suck. But if he had the opportunity to train like we train and see a lot of pitching, he obviously was a freak athlete. You don't put up those numbers and not be a freak athlete. So could he make that adjustment? Probably make some adjustment. I don't know if he can make an adjustment. He wouldn't be like Aaron Judge, probably. I doubt it. But you never know.
It's why it's so difficult to compare eras, because, like, yes, you look at the physical makeup of Babe Ruth, you'd be like, yeah, the guy would get dominated if he played today. But if you had access to the data and to, stuff is, dietitians and the weight room stuff that we have, like, I'm sure he'd adjust. And I think a player that's kind of an interesting example of someone who in their career adjusted is Jose Altuve. Because when he started, he was just slap singles, steal bases, high batting average, and he still maintained a 300 plus average throughout his career. But I remember right around that MVP season, he started hitting 30 home runs a year. And it was like, I think he kind of adjusted to the modern age. Now he's been a unicorn his whole career. He's probably going to be a 3,000 hit guy, but it's just something that he's kind of one of the rare exceptions. One thing, there is something of a downside to all this. And I asked Foolish Baseball about this when I had him on, because I love watching pitchers go to work, and I love guys who throw 100. I love high spin rates, but there has been this crazy influx of pitching injuries over the last, really, I'd say it's the last decade, but I would say over the last 5 years, it's gotten like significantly greater. Do you feel like at some point there's going to be an adjustment where we can keep these pitchers healthier on a longer timeline? Or are things like Tommy John, elbow injuries, shoulder injuries, just things that we're going to have to accept if we want to make sure that these pitchers are still throwing hard and having the spin rates that they have?
That is a great question. I think it's a balance, right? Like, number one, we don't know for sure what causes injuries. We have a pretty good idea. Like, obviously, if you redline your body long enough, the odds are just logically you would get hurt. I think we'd be foolish to say that that's not the case. But there may be some trade-offs, that maybe somebody wants to go deeper in games and they trade something off. There may be a seasonal thing. Like, seems like beginning of the year, you're seeing more injuries, and then later on in the year, there's fewer. Could be guys that are injured in the postseason or off season, and they come in, they try to ramp up, they get hurt. Or it could be just, like anything, you got to work your way up to something. We may get better at that. We may not. That is an open question. If I knew all those answers, I'd probably be rich. But I think we'll probably, we monitor so many things now about pitchers' health that you would think that there'll be some payback on that, and maybe we'll reduce injuries some, but that's hard to say because there's always that pressure to throw hard, right? Like, spin the ball, throw hard, get outs, because it works.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it's so tough because I remember several years back when the Tigers were going through their rebuild, and we will talk about Tarek Skubal at some point here. They very closely monitored the innings of Casey Mize and the innings of Matt Manning and the innings of Tarek Skubal, and yet they did things the correct way, and all three of them at some point suffered major injuries. Like, I don't think throwing hard has a lot to do with it, yes, but I think it's more so the approach that these guys are told to bring to the game, which is maximum torque on every pitch. I just don't think is something that's sustainable. I always use this example, and I've been spoiled growing up as a Tiger fan, but Verlander to me is the master of building up, where you would see so many starts in the prime of his career starting 92, 93, and then by the 7th or 8th inning, he's throwing 100. That's just kind of a dying breed of pitcher. Now it's like, if you got 100, you're throwing 100 in the first inning. And, if I'm a pitcher, I'm doing things that exact same way. I want to get guys out. I want to strike guys out. So it's a really tough kind of balance, because you want to get guys out, but you also want to maintain health throughout your career.
Yeah, and speaking about a former Tigers quote on this, Max Scherzer said that is exactly right. When he first broke into the league, you can get by with throwing a get me over 92 mile an hour fastball because someone's not swinging on the first pitch, you're not trying to do damage, or trying to work the counts and stuff. And he said, now I've got to bring it from pitch one because they're trying to do damage right away against me. They're hunting fastballs. I've got to come up with my best stuff. So it's a change in approach by hitters a lot of times that is causing the pitchers to react this way. I mean, Verlander probably doesn't ramp up as well as he did earlier in his career, where you're right. Like, he was one of those guys that throw, much slower at the beginning of the game and then work his way up, sort of like Nolan Ryan did back in the day too. But they can't do it because of the hitter's approach, and you're going to get burned, and you may be saving all those bullets for a time in the game where you're not in the game because you've got shelled early on.
I think pitch selection and what hitters are expecting from a pitcher have drastically changed. There was an interview that Jim Leland did recently where he was talking about how the game's changed since he stopped being a manager. He's like, back in the day, if it was a 2-0 count, you're just sitting fastball. Now you're just seeing, you see guys lead off with breaking balls. You see guys get behind in counts and they start throwing off speed pitches. It's a completely different repertoire that these guys are featuring. You've been working a few different jobs at this point, but I'm curious, how did the FanDuel gig come about?
They just contacted me. So they liked what I did. They thought that I could help spread the love in, pitching. And, I've always had like kind of a math background. My dad taught math. My brother was a professional poker player. Won a gold bracelet in the World Series of Poker.
Oh, nice.
Yeah. So it's one of those things that I've always liked it. I thought it would be a good way to kind of test what I know and challenge myself to look at the game differently. So that's really what it came from. And I'll tell you, it's hard. Like, parlays is freaking impossible. And even with, I figure I know pitchers as well as anybody, and I can't consistently win. No way.
It's difficult on its own. And this is somebody I used to work for a gaming company, so I do have some experience with this. It's difficult on its own. And I would say baseball is the most difficult because it is the most random. And you're just talking about pitchers. I'm just talking like if you're talking straight up money line or run line, like this year's White Sox are probably going to be the worst team ever. They've still won 30 something games. There's still been those days where they've probably been underdogs in almost every single game. And yet there's more of a randomness to the sport because of how long the season is. What's kind of the number one lesson or mindset change that you've had about gambling since you've started working for a gambling company?
Really how hard it is. Like that was the thing. Like I expected to at least be able to win pretty often. Cause again, I watch every game and I watch every game in a lot of detail and watch every pitch and know, basically all the pitchers. And when I feel like they're doing well, I can usually uncover a diamond in the rough type guy too, but it is just so hard. There's always one thing that gets you in a parlay. And I've been trying to do parlays mostly because I wanted to test it and see, is it really as hard as people say? And yeah, it is. I'm not going to lie.
Yeah. It's something that they're fun when they hit, obviously. And it is fun to follow. Like,
exactly.
Yeah. Which is what it's supposed to be. It is supposed to be, fun. And it was, I remember even, as somebody who didn't have a ton of experience with it, I got into it when I was working at, still working at Barstool. But, one thing that I talk about as a Tiger fan in a lot of my videos is the influence of our pitching coach, who's got probably, aside from Dan Campbell, maybe the highest approval rating of any Detroit coach right now with Chris Fetter, the job that he's done in Detroit. I'm just curious, do you feel like the role of the pitching coach is more important than it's been because of the data that we have access to at this point?
I would say without a doubt, it's harder. It's actually more important because, pitchers can teach themselves stuff, but as a pitching coach, you can throw all the data at a pitcher and some guys will soak it up. Other guys will be like, yeah, I don't want to hear that. I don't want You have to know how to drive each individual pitcher, what's important about them, how to make them stand out, find their little unicorn qualities and say, all right, that's going to be your thing. as well as tinker with mechanics. You have to have a pretty good understanding of everything, including technology, where back in the day, if you played and you pitched at a decent level and you were able to, be that guy, like slap everybody on the back and whatever, you probably can stay in the league for a while. Now, it's rough. You're competing against guys that, understand technology a ton, maybe can't communicate it. Then there are guys that are really good communicators. Right now, you have to have a lot of different tools. Federer is one of those guys. And he also has Robin Lund alongside him, which I've interviewed Robin before. Great dude, very smart. And I think earlier in the season, I said Lund and Federer deserve the Nobel Prize for pitching with what they've done for pitchers. Like, they've been outstanding. I love what their approach is. And, it's good for the Tigers in the long run.
We've made our GM and president look pretty smart over the last several years. Cause we went out and got Jack Flaherty, who was, rubber arm, kind of seemed like he was over the hill. He was fantastic this season. They turned Michael Lorenzen into an all-star. It has been pretty inspiring to watch as a fan when it's like, okay, maybe we can take some flyers out on guys and they can be pretty successful. And that does bring me to the guy who right now, as the time of this recording, I think is a heavy favorite to win the American League Cy Young, and that's Tarik Skubal. It's been so much fun, especially as somebody who roots for a team that hasn't had a whole lot to cheer for over the last 7-8 years, to see a guy get national attention like this. I guess, when was your first exposure? Because he was a 9th round pick. He did become a top prospect, but he was not somebody he wasn't like Mize, who was number 1 overall pick. What was your kind of first exposure to Skubal being like, this guy's got legitimate stuff?
Well, my first exposure to Skubal was I was handed a phone and he was on the other end of it when he was in college. Wow. So he was at Seattle University, and I was pitching coach for my son's high school team. The head coach ended up moving to Seattle as an assistant coach at Seattle and said, this guy wants to talk to you and has some questions for you. And it's like, that's a funny name, Tarik Skubal. It's great. And we just, yeah, exactly. Yeah. We started talking, and I didn't know he was going to be great or anything, but he had really good questions. And so I just followed him since then, ever since then. And he totally remembers this call. Like, it was just a very odd thing. I brought it up when I talked to him the other day, and it was like, yep, totally remember it. Wow. But yeah, so he was one of those guys that I'd followed for a while. I didn't know that he'd be Tarik Skubal, the Cy Young Award winner. Mm-hmm. But yeah, he's a phenomenal dude, wants to learn a lot. So he's very smart, very talented. Love his ability to compete. Like, that dude on the bump gets a big K, screams, showman, seems to have the right attitude too. He doesn't get too tense. He's a competitor, but can laugh on the field. A lot of things to like about that guy. He is a freaking stud.
His growth has kind of made this entire Tigers season worthwhile, to be honest. Really, the last few years. And you saw when he came back from injury, the last month of the season last year, he was American League Pitcher of the Month. And you're like, man, if this carries over, we are talking about a legitimate Cy Young contender. And I think the word you use is correct, which is smart, because I remember when we had him on the show and he's talking about seam shifted weight change and all this stuff. Like, he is like a data sponge, it seems, with kind of figuring out and learning about pitching. And I think that's so fascinating because his stuff is so naturally good that I feel like it would be easy for a lefty, especially who's got 100 in his back pocket, to just say, forget the data, I'm just going to trust my stuff. And I think that he has become a guy who has grown so much as a pitcher. And he was open about it. He's like, look, when I was in the minors, I threw 70% fastballs. And like, that's just not going to fly when you get to the big league level. And he's developed this changeup that's been unhittable in the zone. I mean, I think that's what's really kind of allowed him to soar, is he gets swing and miss in the zone. Like, guys don't really chase. He's just that good at locating. No, it's been pretty amazing to watch, and that's a great story about you talking to him. And it's unsurprising to me, because he just seems like a guy who is constantly learning, which is just a great sign.
He is, and a great point about his changeup. It is one of the filthiest changeups in baseball, and he throws it differently than most people do. Like, when I teach changeups, I used to teach, basically a ton of pronation. Like, if you can pronate through it, like a Devin Williams type thing, he doesn't pronate his changeup. He actually thinks about cutting it to get the seam shifted wake on his changeup. He and Chris Sale, Chris Sale told me the same thing. He's like, Chris Sale just learned it. Like, you're thinking Chris Sale, like most old school pitcher in baseball, probably one of the least likely guys I think would take in information. He went to the Braves. He said, this guy said, hey, why don't you try cutting your changeup? Have you ever tried this? Like, he looked at him like he was just odd. He's like, what? He's like, just try it. And he did it, and it ended up rotating correctly. He's like, wait a second, how is that happening? And it eventually did. He's not, he doesn't like Chris Sale. It's great to show he's that open-minded to learn that. But I feel like Skubal seeks that out.
Yeah.
And he is a new school pitcher without it getting bogged down too much in why this happens. There are other guys that have to know every bit of the science about it. He'll trust people, but he'll ask questions, which is a great combination.
Every guy that I've talked to on here, whether they were a hitter or a pitcher in baseball, I always ask them, like, how far do you take the access that you have to data and analytics? And there's some guys that say, especially hitters, they just, my whole thing is, I see ball, hit ball. Like, sometimes it's a little bit too much. I think with somebody like him, I think that he hasn't overdone it. And the progression of his changeup has been very interesting, because his rookie season, or his first full season, he started with a split change grip and then changed, I think, after April. I think it was Fetter and AJ Hinch said, you got to go back to your regular grip. It's ended up becoming one of the best pitches in baseball. I bring it up, and you've brought it up. We have so much access to pitch data and spin rates and velo nowadays, and it's fun. It's fun to go back and look at, kind of the modern age and how certain pitchers stack up. But we haven't always had that luxury. Who's a pitcher from back in the day that you would have loved to have had access to their pitch data just to see, like, did they really throw that hard? Did they spin the ball as effectively as they looked? Who's a guy that you would have liked to have seen?
I mean, I would love to see Nolan Ryan's.
That's mine too.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I know he threw hard, but I think the 108 was a little bit made up.
There's no way. There's no way.
Yeah. I did a whole video on that and kind of debunked it. Like, if you look at the readings in that game, he was throwing 80. They had had him at 88 in the first inning, in the first few innings, then sprinkled in some 87s. And then all of a sudden 100.2, and they extrapolate that out because they said it read it somewhere between 10 and 15 feet in front of. I don't buy that. It was a number one, is a promotional thing. Number two, the technology they were using was just like they didn't know where they even aimed it. So we wouldn't treat that as a scientific reading today. It's just not. But then again, he did throw hard, no doubt. And did he throw 100? Sure. Did he throw 105? Probably not. But 102, 103, maybe. Like, I can get there with that. And he had an absolute hammer and a wicked changeup later in his career. Brilliant pitcher. But yeah, I would love to see that data on him.
Yeah, no, it would be very interesting. And you brought up kind of like the velocity and radar guns, which were imperfect for a long time. I'm just curious, and maybe maybe you don't, but like, when was the era where we kind of figured that out? Because I know that by the 90s, pretty consistently, they were showing like velo on the broadcast. Was it right around then when they kind of finally had that data figured out?
That is probably a good point, a good starting point to look at. That data was pretty darn good. It used to be, though, like in the 70s, you'd occasionally they'd have a gun in a game. You go back and you can watch some of the old games. Matter of fact, I have. And watching Nolan Ryan in the 70s, there were games where like Nolan Ryan's hit 90 miles an hour 20 times this game. I'm like, good for you. So did like Kyle Hendricks.
Yeah.
But it's the gun was acquiring the object later. So the readings were lower because the technology in the radar gun itself was a little slower into picking it up. So it acquired the target later, which would mean the ball was slowing down on the way to the plate, as it does. So you were getting slower readings. So no doubt Ryan threw harder than 90 miles an hour. There are readings. I think I saw his last pitch was in the upper 90s, and that was at 45. So could you get there that he was throwing it well in the hundreds? Yeah, you could. But again, 108, I think, is wacky. But yes, looking at in the 90s, I think that's fair. The gun readings were
yeah, it kind of seemed like, and that's just a lot of that's eye test on my part, just watching the broadcast. I feel like right around it kind of post strike. Like, it seemed like, but 95 and beyond, we started to see more velocity be shown on the broadcast. The sport of baseball is ever evolving and ever changing. And I kind of wanted to ask you about some potential rule changes that will affect pitchers and obviously affect hitters a lot. There's been so much talk about the strike zone challenge system, which I think is going to come in Major League Baseball here at some point soon. I guess just what are your thoughts on it? And do you feel like it's something that is more likely to negatively impact pitchers or more likely to positively impact pitchers?
I think it's more likely, and I've talked to both hitters and pitchers, and they give me different points. Brent Rooker told me that it is going to be way easy for hitters if you know the zone. He felt like in the minor leagues, pitchers thought that the strike zone was too small when you have a robo ump. Challenge system's different because you're going to get fewer of those challenged. Then I've heard pitchers like Chris Bassett told me, oh man, I'm going to throw a breaking pitcher that just barely clipped the zone. Rich Hill said the same thing. Like I could throw these breaking pitcher curveballs. They're going to clip the top of the zone and a hitter has no prayer on hitting it. And I can see that too. So it's going to be really interesting. I think it's going to be fun for fans. It adds another bit of strategy about when to challenge a pitch. And I think it's fairer to umpires. Umpiring a game is really tough. I've tried to do it. I suck. And it's just tough, especially when guys are throwing ridiculous velo where we can see it at home that an umpire messed up, but yet the umpire himself can't check it. Like that doesn't even seem fair. It seems like they should have the same information that we have and make a good call. Like I don't think they really do want to hose hitters or hose pitchers, but it's just tough with breaking pitches moving the way they do and fastball velo. Like it's a hard thing to do. So give them all the help you can have. Challenge system, awesome. Make it into a drinking game. Yeah, I'm all for that. Like, I think fans will have fun with that.
And I've interviewed a few minor leaguers who've played, with the challenge system and said it's been fun. It's been interactive. I mean, it's comparable to for people who watch tennis, that kind of Hawkeye system, which is also controversial. There's players that hate the Hawkeye system, but it's fun on the broadcast when they show the ball landing, and I think it's kind of a unique thing. But you brought up umpires, and I've made this argument that some people have disagreed with on, but I stand by it. I'm under the belief that umpires are better than they've ever been. It's just that the criticism of umpires and the magnification of every call is bigger than it's been because, let's be honest, the count is more important than it was. It sounds strange, but it's more important than it was even 30 years ago. We have more walks. We have more strikeouts. We have more guys who are trying to take and see more pitches. Would you agree with that assessment that it's there, even with the criticism, umpires are probably as good as they've been?
It is not even close. Go back and watch, like in the off season, what I do is I break down old games and old pitchers and stuff. And you can get away with a lot. Umpires, if they liked you, would give you calls. And there was no box on the screen that you can see if the umpire messed up or not. It was basically like, yeah, if you have Eric Gregg calling a game, it was obvious that those weren't strikes. But generally, you really had a hard time second guessing umpires. Be like, oh, that's not a strike, or that is. Now you know, and we have multiple accounts on X that will check on umpires and grade them and stuff, and right away whether an umpire misses a call. Back then, yeah, it was all however they felt, just messing around. And it is not close. Like umpires are very good today, other than a few. Some of them may have retired, but
yes, or been forced out / retired recently. No, I totally agree with you, and it's one of those things where I think back in the day it was if you hit your spot, it's going to get called a strike. And you like the Eric Gregg example is the famous one in '97, the Game 5 between the Marlins and the Braves. But if you go back and watch like Kerry Wood's 20 strikeout game, he had pitches that were like 5-6 inches off the plate that were getting called. Still nasty stuff, but it was just I think that the game has changed. Pedro's 17 strikeout game against the Yankees was another example where it was more so about hitting your spots than necessarily hitting the zone. We focus much more on it than we used to. You're one of those content creators who I've come to know your personality. I've come to know the face, but originally for the longest time, I just knew you as a Twitter avatar. Like I knew the logo. And it's a great logo. It's a recognizable logo, but I'm just curious, as things grew for you, did you have a kind of fear of a loss of anonymity, so to speak? Like, was there a concern about you putting your face out there on podcasts and videos?
It was more just scaring people off, staring at my face.
I've been there.
No, I actually love it. Like, it's one of those things. Maybe a tiny bit, like when you're first doing that and you're on, you're getting out there, are people going to like you and all that stuff? Like everybody, I think, gets that. But I actually love it. Like I'll be out was just flying. My parents had their anniversary, and I was flying to Florida, and somebody stopped me in the airport and was like, "Are you Rob Friedman, Pitching Ninja?" I'm like, "Yeah." You go to games and everybody, like, I love that stuff. Like, because sitting at home behind a computer, you don't know, like, if you had any impact. I post things that I like. I don't, even if somebody likes it or retweets it, doesn't mean that they like what you do. But when people come up to you and they say, they start asking you questions, or they just say, "I love your stuff," they don't have to do that. To me, that's the greatest thing that comes with this, is somebody, if I'm out and somebody recognizes me, that's fantastic. So I love it. But yeah, I think at first there was a little hesitancy. I would maybe rather have been like, let the content speak for itself. But yeah, now I enjoy it. I think it's fun.
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure you get it so much more consistently, but it's my favorite part of the gig too. Like, I love going to Comerica, and I think what's so cool about it, and it's one of the cooler parts of social media, is how much watching a game is more of a shared experience now, where even if you don't go, you feel like you're experiencing it online with people. And like with the videos that I do, just recapping Tiger games, it's you make a connection, and it really is a lot of fun, and you've earned it, man. I mean, the content's always been good. I've always been a pitching guy. Like, even before all this, like a 2-0 baseball game is like my jam. Like, I've always been, like, and I know people can say I'm crazy. Maybe it's the Tiger fan in me who like grew up with Verlander and Scherzer and like that great rotation. But I grew up with Miguel Cabrera too. So it's like, I'm not saying I'm against great hitting, but I've always been more of a pitching guy. This is a tough one, putting you on the spot. What's the filthiest pitch in baseball right now?
Ooh, that is a tough one. I will always fall back on the Airbender, Devin Williams changeup, because I named it. Like, I mean, if I came up with the name, so I'm a little bit biased, but also I think it's the most unique pitch in baseball. We were talking about Pedro before, but even Pedro, obviously one of the greatest changeup of all time. I'm not going to get struck by lightning. But I would say Devin Williams' changeup is the most unique changeup of all time, and probably the filthiest changeup of all time too.
Have you ever had a pitcher, because you brought up the Airbender changeup, have you ever had a pitcher reach out to you, thank you, or talk about or mention the fact that you gave one of their pitches a name in the past?
Oh, all the time.
Oh, really?
That happens regularly. As a matter of fact, Devin Williams, for one, wore pitching ninja cleats in a game. Like, nice. He wore pitching ninja cleats, and has said in interviews, like, he wasn't even sure if he could use the Airbender because I came up with it. I'm like, dude, it's your pitch. You
didn't copyright it?
Yeah, no, hell no. Yeah, maybe I fell down on my lawyer stuff, but I just love, like, it's easy. What happens is usually in the middle of the night, like a name will pop into my head as I'm waking up. I usually will wake up in the middle of the night for whatever reason, because I can't sleep. Mm-hmm. And it's a time where my mind just starts thinking, and I'll be like, you know what if I did this? Came up with Ben Joyce's nickname, the volunteer fireman, in the middle of the night. The human glitch, Jimmy Hurriet. Just a bunch of these things just come to me. I think even swords, the idea of calling it a sword, came to me in the middle of the night. I was like, why don't we do that? And then I just throw it out there, and if it's good, it's good. If it's not, whatever.
Was that terminology like a Rob Friedman original? Because really good for you, man. Because and it's so weird because that's a perfect terminology. Like, that is that half swing. It's great. Yeah.
Well, in fairness, it came up through Benchwarmers, the movie. They said, "Don't chop at it; it's not a sword." And I was like,
right. Okay,
and that was 10 years before I called anything a sword.
Right.
But once I started doing that, I was like, why don't we just call them swords? Like, don't chop it, it's not a sword. Well, if you do it, it should be a sword. And I just started calling them all swords, and then all of a sudden, it's just started taking off. And it's one of those things, man. My mind doesn't work right sometimes.
Well, I think that's a baseball fan thing. Like, it's just in our nature to kind of come up with I've come up with some of the silliest nicknames for Tiger players in the 8 years I've been doing this, but it's just like, you watch enough, your mind wanders off to strange places. I think that you've become exclusive in the baseball content game, where it's like, as a pitcher, you've made it when you've been featured on Pitching Ninja. And if you're a player that gets ejected, that you've made it when John Boy is reading your lips and
totally
telling you, like, how you've ripped an umpire. Like, it's like, those are the go-tos now, where you hear it on broadcasts. I know we've had the fortune this year of we upgraded our play-by-play. We got Jason Benetti doing games, and dude, That was the best. That's the best free agent signing we've made in a decade. Really, I mean, Benetti is the man. He brought you up on the air multiple times, and one of the smartest broadcasters, period, across all sports right now. Yeah,
totally agree. Like that dude, his mind works so well with he has references for everything.
He's not a.
He's right. Hilarious. He's a hilarious dude. He's a great dude. Heart's in the right place. He loves the game. There's not enough things that you could say about that guy, good things you could say about the guy, just an absolute gem. And there is not a better broadcaster in the game than Jason Benetti. There just isn't. And yeah, like I've been on his podcast before when he was doing it, and I was honored. Like he's just one of those guys that I love the way his mind thinks. He's so much fun.
We're trying to get him on the show. Now, it's hard because the guy, you bring up how talented he is, and you're right. He's also the hardest working broadcaster in the world. The guy, I swear to God, I've seen him call 2 games at once, because he'll do, especially with the Tigers now, he'll do a Friday game, fly out to the West Coast, do a Saturday college football game, and be back for a Saturday afternoon game in Detroit. And like I bring it up in the interview that I do with Dan Miller, the Lions play-by-play guy. We take our broadcasters very seriously in Detroit. I mean, we know whether it's that stems from Ernie Harwell, and then we get Dan Dickerson doing radio, and Benetti has been an unbelievable upgrade. And I think he's a great 21st century broadcaster in the sense that you bring up the references, like he does bring up stuff like your account, and I think kind of that the 21st century analytics, but while also making it very accessible to people. It doesn't feel like he's isolating his audience at any point.
Yeah, and he's also a former lawyer or law student, at least, so we had that in common. Yeah, I believe he went to Wake. So I've talked to him about that too, because there's something about, you can tell the way he turns a phrase, just the way his mind works. But yeah, dude, I always wonder, how do these broadcasters work that hard? Like they're everywhere, especially that dude. I mean, doing college basketball sometimes, he's everywhere, and you have to know a ton about the sport to call it. Like he's not one of those guys that just makes stuff up and you're like, oh, he doesn't know what he's talking about. Matter of fact, I don't know of a time where I've thought he didn't know what he was talking about. Right. No matter how deep he dives into analytics or whatever, he'll challenge players on stuff. Like players will say, yeah, the stats nowadays. And he'll be like, well, actually, the reason why they do it is that, and then convince them that they should look at these analytics. Like he is the perfect broadcaster for today's baseball and for anything. Like that dude, I can listen to him call a game. As a matter of fact, whenever I have a choice of who to listen to, I default to Benetti every time. Yeah. Like, he is my man.
He's been fantastic. The fans fell in love with him quickly. I was stunned just because he was so a key piece of those White Sox broadcasts. I knew he grew up in Chicago. So when I saw that, like it was almost as if we acquired like a really good player. I'm like, oh sweet, we got one of the best. This is awesome. And I think his versatility, you bring it up in terms of sports, but like he'll be doing in the booth with Kirk Gibson, and he'll be talking about the 84 team or whatever. And then they'll bring on J.K. Simmons, and he'll just be tossing questions about Whiplash or Spider-Man. Or it's like there's that versatility, I think, as a broadcaster is so important. We were talking about rule changes a little bit a minute ago, and I think the challenge system is on its way here. But another thing that's been talked about a little bit is the idea of a 6-inning minimum potentially for starting pitchers. I'm with you. For people who are listening to this in audio format, you're shaking your head. I agree. I don't think it's going to happen. I don't think the players would ever agree to it. But 2, explain to the people why it's not a good idea.
Oh, there are so many reasons. I don't, one of it is a fallacy about, back in my day, there were all these pitchers duels and it's all about starting pitching. Well, I think we've proven that relievers can be the filthiest pitchers on the field, and to give them short shrift isn't really fair. Like there are games where absolutely I only turn it on because they're in the bullpen and I want to see what this guy does. Give me Ben Joyce coming out of the bullpen every day of the week over some generic starter. The other thing is, like, you're talking about guys like, say, Jacob deGrom comes up.
Yeah.
Do you want him to have to throw 6 innings when he first comes up? Or do you want them to bring him up early, let him work his way, his pitch count up and all that, versus doing it all in the minors? And now you're only seeing him once he's already stretched out. I would rather see him throw 4 or 5 innings for a few games in the majors, kind of like what they did with Paul Skeens. Bring him, you can bring these guys up earlier. Maybe they don't throw 100 pitches. Maybe they're throwing 80 pitches at first. The other thing is it's just their pitchers. Everybody's different. There are some guys that are absolutely built to throw 100 pitches. Some guys that tire at 80. Why are we making the judgment? Why are we throwing a blanket and saying 100 is a number? Why is 100 the number for one? I have no idea. It's a round number. Why is 6 innings a number? Don't know. But why can't we just let teams compete in a way that they think is best with the folks that they have on the field versus shoehorning it and saying they've got to go 6 innings? I think there's a number of problems with it. I understand the problem is one of the problems they're trying to solve are injuries. Like maybe pitchers won't throw as hard and they'll pace themselves more. I think that is wishful thinking.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah, the genie's already out of the bottle on that. You're going to want your nastiest stuff, period. And you're just trying to throw it nasty for 100 pitches. And
I'm with you completely. I think the intent of that rule, I like the idea of valuing the starting pitcher a little bit more. And a big problem I have is I think the way that a lot of teams manage their pitching in the postseason has a tendency to be a little bit robotic. Like we've seen instances, Jose Barrios in the wild card round last year, the famous one, Blake Snell in Game 6 in 2020, where it's like, man, these guys they're kind of tossing the game of their lives in a big situation. And I hate the fact that, well, the spreadsheet says we got to take this guy out. Like I don't like that. But at the same time, 6 innings, most pitchers don't go 6 innings anymore, right? Really. The average start is not. And I think in a lot of ways it creates a massive competitive disadvantage for certain teams. I think the Tigers, are an example that I use. They've won a lot of games over the last month, but they have Mize back now. For a solid month, 60% of their games were bullpen days. And I have where they were having to cobble together a staff. If you have a situation like that and you have a reliever essentially who's having to go 6 innings, I think it's going to lead to the rich teams getting richer and the poor teams getting poorer. I think it removes a lot of the strategy.
I totally agree. And you have some, it's the Tigers have done this a number of times. We have an opener, you have Tyler Holton starting a game, and then you bring in Brant Herter or somebody to throw the next 5. Does he count as a starter? Who's a starter? Does Holton have to go? That's a strategy to get you by the first few hitters and then bring somebody in, maybe make it a little easier for the guy and let him ramp his way up into the game. There are a number of reasons why you would do that. So you're messing with a team's strategy of how they want to compete in a game. And I don't think that that's the way that baseball should be doing stuff. I wasn't a fan necessarily of the relievers having to face a certain amount of hitter, but I get that because there are times where pitching changes slow up the game. This isn't a slowing up the game issue. This is either a worshiping starting pitching issue. And I love a marquee starting pitching matchup. Mm-hmm. Don't get me wrong. There's nothing better in baseball than a playoff game where you have big names going at it. But combating a big name with a bullpen game where you're bringing out the mixing and matching stuff, that takes creativity and creates excitement too. Like, how long are we going to go with this guy? And, the Blake Snell situation, it takes care of itself because you get second guess the crap out of if you pull a guy with a perfect game or no hitter, after 5 innings because your little spreadsheet says you need to. Nobody, he may fade after that, but you don't know until you know. Let the guy go deeper and see what he does. Maybe this time he learned to navigate a lineup. Law of, there's a law of small sample sizes or big numbers, whatever it is. Guys grow during the season and they're able to compete in different ways. So part of being a coach or a pitching coach is helping them navigate that, getting them to, figuring out the player has now jumped over that hurdle that now they can go deeper in games. That is a skill. And now you're just saying, you got to do it. I don't think that that's the right thing.
Yeah, I'm with you. And I think especially this might be kind of a boomer take on my part, but I do believe in big games, in postseason games, there's a psychological element that it can't be quantified on a spreadsheet or on, analytically. The run I always go to is it probably in many ways didn't make sense for Bruce Bochy to stick with Madison Bumgarner as much as he did in 2014, but he was just locked in. And that was, to this day, remains probably the greatest run of pitching that I've seen in a postseason ever. It was incredible.
Totally agree. And I don't think that's a boomer take at all. I think we get too caught up in analytics sometimes. I am a big analytics fan, big. Yeah. But there's also a human element to the game where there are definitely guys who you knew Madison Bumgarner was out there and there was no way your team was scoring more than 1 run. So you're going to have to chip away the whole time. I don't care what the analytics told me. Like as a Braves fan too, in the 90s watching that team, you knew John Smoltz was that guy that was not going to get beat in a big game. And I don't care what he did during the regular season. If you were in a big game, that was the guy that you wanted out there every time. So there is something to be said for coaches that are able to take the analytical part as well as the human element. Anybody that stood over a 3-foot putt with money on the line knows that there's a such thing as being clutch.
Yeah.
And the idea that there's no such thing as that doesn't make any sense to me. There are people that, that can answer questions when they're not on the spot, and when they're on their spot, they can't think quick enough. We have that in everything. Same thing with saying there's no such thing as team chemistry. There absolutely is. If you're working with jerks in the real world in any job, you're less productive. You're like, I want to go home. I don't want to work with this dude. This guy's a butthead. I don't want to work with this guy. And it just makes teams worse in corporations. Why would that not make a team worse in a sport? Obviously it does. There are guys that are good team players that may not be the best player on the team that actually help. And there are guys that are terrible team players that may have a lot of talent, but it's all about them.
Yeah, it's why I roll my eyes at the take of like managers don't matter. I think that the whole idea of, okay, yes, in game, can a manager win you a ball game the way that like a head coach can in the NFL or a defensive coordinator can? Probably not. But to me, the best managers are responsible for two things. One is in-game strategy. How are you managing your bullpen? What lineup are you putting together? But the other big one is culture. And I know that one thing that when I was kind of coming up when I was in high school, Jim Leland at the time was a very controversial figure because he had a very old-fashioned way about him. And I'm not going to say that I agreed with every move that he made because he made some very controversial ones near the end. Players ran through walls for him. They loved playing for him. That does, especially when these guys are your family for 6 months of the year. I mean, you see these people every day. You see them more than you see your actual family. If there's not some sort of camaraderie or connection, the team's just not going to work. And I think we've seen that. Totally.
And you can hire the smartest person on earth to run a team. That doesn't mean they're going to do a good job of getting the most out of talent. You can it's not a fantasy baseball team. You're not taking X, Y, and Z and saying, well, I have the best numbers, so I'm going to win. You've seen some of the best talented teams or most talented teams not play as well. And then some of the lesser talented teams or guys with similar talent get a little bit more out of it because there's something to be said about a player being allowed to fail sometimes and knowing that everybody has his back out there, knowing the manager has his back, managers knowing what buttons to push. Some guys need to be, you need to yell at them. Other guys need to be pumped up because they're a little hard on themselves. And they want somebody to say, hey, chill, it'll be okay. Like, just keep doing it. It takes that as a manager and to create the right playing environment for a team. I totally agree with you. I think a manager is a hugely important role. And it's not just for in-game decisions because you can get a computer to make in-game decisions.
Right. No, I agree. I totally. And that's why I like the guy that we have in Detroit. I've always been a big AJ Hinch guy for that reason, is that he's not overly robotic. And I do think there's some teams, I'm not going to name them necessarily, that employ managers kind of as puppets. And I just think that's a terrible idea. It's like, I don't even blame the managers for it, but I think that there are managers in baseball that don't construct the lineup on a day-to-day basis. I think that it comes from the front office. And to me, it's not a surprise when those teams get popped in the postseason. I don't think that's a winning formula.
Just think how hard it is to manage like that too. Like you are constantly being second guessed by somebody that has all these, why did you do this? That if we ran this simulation 1,000 times that we would win this, they would score one more run a game. Well, you know what? This guy had a hard day. He told me before the game that, he didn't feel like he was at his best or whatever. You have to take that into account as a manager. Or you want to build somebody up for the long run. You may put him in a regular season game. He's not the best choice, but you may need him later on, or he needs reps or whatever. That's what a manager does. We're not computers. We don't, there are other reasons to put guys in spots. And yeah, Hinch is one of those guys. He strikes me as I haven't been managed by him, but I've seen enough press conferences with him. He's a very personable guy who explains himself well, and seems like he'd be that guy, as a manager as well.
Yeah, well, he's a psychology major from Stanford, so he has that. It's a pretty good background to have if you're going to be a baseball manager.
Totally,
that's that kind of new age. much different than like Sparky Anderson, I can imagine, in terms of just the way that he deals with people. Both very effective, but much different. You post so many different gifs of a few more questions for you. You post so many different gifs of pitchers, and the ones that people navigate or gravitate towards are the guys that are competing for Cy Youngs or closing down games. Devin Williams, the airbender changeup. Who's a pitcher that you post often whose stuff you feel like is significantly better than his numbers are?
I mean, I can tell you a guy that I knew was going to be better. Unfortunately, he's gotten hurt this year, but Reese Olson was one of those guys that. So I saw Reese Olson was a Georgia guy, so he grew up around here, and I saw him play. My son was playing on one field. I walked by him pitch, and I was like, dude, I love the way this dude throws. And he was in high school then, and then I watched him throw for the Tigers and watched how well he spun the ball. I'm like, is everybody seeing this? This guy is filthy. And the results weren't there. So he's one of those guys, like sometimes you can see that kind of happen, that it just like, it clicks in your head. I think for the White Sox, I'm looking at Davis Martin's changeup has really stood out to me as a really nasty pitch. And I don't think anybody outside of White Sox fans follows Davis Martin, but I've noticed I'm like, this is a legit one of the better changeups in baseball. I don't think anybody's following that. I like Brant Herter played with my son at Georgia Tech, so I saw,
nice.
Yeah, and he actually threw in my basement here. I have a bullpen in my basement, but he is one of those guys that's sitting behind the plate and watching him. Dude, it doesn't even do it justice.
That sweeper his really moves. I mean, he's going to get swing and miss with that throughout his career. I really like him. Yeah.
Yeah, he is one of those guys that absolutely gets a ton of movement. And again, like sitting behind on plate, you can see why people can't hit it because that thing moves 2 different time zones when he throws it. But yeah, there are a ton of guys that just like jump out at me when I'm watching them. And then I'm like, I just can assume that they're going to be better. It doesn't always happen. Like there are times where I'll be like, he didn't, why isn't this guy any better? But a lot of times I'll be on, somebody for years and be tweeting them. And then all of a sudden Blake Trinan back in the day, like Blake Trinan before he became the Blake Trinan, he was in he was with the Nationals. And I kept posting him going, this is ridiculous. And then he finally broke out and people are like, he got traded after that. And they're like, well, why couldn't he do it on the Nats? I'm like, dude, if you were watching him, he was doing this on the Nats. It's just that he didn't have the confidence and people were booing him all the time because he ended up getting the confidence in what he did and then dialing it in. So as fans, sometimes we need more patience and just watch the game and watch what's happening with your eyes and maybe, add in some numbers to it. Look at the analytics, go to Baseball Savant, check it out. But a lot of times it's just about patience. And these are people too. They need confidence. And that develops over time for most guys. Not everybody comes in a league like Paul Skeens.
Yeah.
A lot of guys have to work their way up. And that's part of the journey of a fan. Like as a fan, I would rather find these diamonds in the rough and be part of a crappy team. And then all of a sudden it became good than, be a fan of a team that's always good.
Yeah, no, I'm with you, man. It's like there's especially when they're your guys. Like I've seen Verlander win the Cy Young here. I've seen Scherzer do it, but there is something about the guy that came up through your system, whose minor league games you were following. And I'm really glad you brought up Reese Olson because that is, and the Al Avila tenure was not a successful one. But man, you look at that move. The Brewers must have really seen something in Daniel Norris because Reese Olson and the Brewers are a smart organization.
Yeah, they are.
When we got him, I remember people saying like, the results aren't there. He's got one of the highest spin rates of any slider in the minor leagues. Like that's something to work with. And yeah, before the injury, I mean, like Skubal, obviously an ace. He was a legit number 2 in this rotation. He'd really come alive. And I know the organization had gotten to him. The one pitcher that comes to mind when I think of stuff versus results, and I don't think he's pitched this year. The Japanese pitcher who pitched for the A's and then he pitched for the Orioles a little bit last year. Was it Fujinami? Yeah, they filthy stuff. Didn't know where the ball was going, but I remember he had one inning against us on July 4th last season where he struck out the side. And I'm convinced that inning alone is like what got him traded to the Orioles because people are like, this guy's stuff is legitimate. And I think that is the issue with relievers. Another guy we experienced, like Gregory Soto was like that with us for a long time. We're like, man, lefty pumps 100, 101 from, with movement. Just can't really find it. But yeah, no, it is when they put it together, they can be unhittable.
Great call on Fuji too, because he was one of those guys. So it jumped out at me that he was a guy that maybe an introvert and lacked confidence. So
Yeah.
he had stuff jump a 103-mile-an-hour fastball and a wicked splitter. And I watched the way like Adley dealt with them. And I was like, I see it. Adley gets it too. He had to pump him up and he sat there, puts his arm around him and stuff. Like you have to do that. And that's part of being a catcher or a manager or a coach, is knowing what drives a player and how to get the most out of him. Fuji was one of those guys that I think needed that. And we think we're looking at the talent that the guy has, but part of talent is mental game. And we just ignore the mental game as fans a lot of times. But, you boo a player. What does that do to their psyche? Some guys, it drives them to be better. Other guys, it's like, man, I suck. Like, now they're on me too. And then they don't want to come in the game. And it spirals for them. And I think, you're calling out. That's why some of these guys, their stuff doesn't match their performance sometimes.
Yeah, for sure. Well, look, I can honestly talk ball with you all day. I love this conversation. This has been fantastic. You've always done good stuff, man. And I recommend, we're going to make sure to link to all your socials. Not that you need it technically at this point, but I feel like you've done me a favor by being on my show. Always appreciate what you do and the way that you grow the game. And you are officially a friend of the program, which is exclusive company to be in, as I think this is episode 20 something. So I would love to have you on again and continue to support your stuff. And thanks for hopping on Chris.
I'll come on again. How about when Jackson Jobe gets called up?
Yes, another friend of the program. That's another. I forgot to. He was originally listed on my notes. That's going to be. That's R. Strasburg. Really,
really good. I've interviewed him too.
Smart guy.
Yeah, unbelievable ceiling that dude has. Like, man, this is a good time to be a Tigers fan.
That spring training inning that he threw where he locked down his, that was I actually had family that was at that game, and I talked to AJ about that, because the way it set up was it was a 1-0 game where he came in and got the save, and I asked AJ, like, was that part of the theater there, or did you expect that it was going to be a save situation? He goes, no, we just want him to pitch in the back end of a game. And it was like the greatest inning ever. That was one of those, like, it was kind of a special moment, because all of Tigers Twitter was like, whoa, he might actually be this legit. And it's so tough, because you look at that history, it's a roll of the dice, that first high school pitcher taken in a draft. But watching that inning, you immediately realize why a guy goes the third in the draft, or, coming out of high school. Like, that stuff is ridiculous. He had 4+ pitches that he was striking guys out with. Yeah,
dude, it's one of those things, like, and you mentioned how pumped up Tigers fans were. You can imagine me, like, I'm sitting there. There are times, and that was one of them this year, where I'm watching a guy and I'm like, I can't wait to get this out there. I can't wait to get this out there. I've got to, because this is mind blowing, his stuff. And that was one of them. And that's a great feeling for me. Like, I am far from jaded watching pitchers. And that was about as exciting a moment as there was. There've been a few. I think that like Chapman throwing 105.1 that game. And, several of them, Ben Joyce a few times, and Mason Miller early in the season, was like, there are games where I am so excited to get it out there. And I'm glad that y'all were that excited, because I was that excited watching it too. That was so cool.
For sure. No, we'll make sure to schedule that when he makes his debut, and we can dissect and hopefully drool over the positive results that come from that. But again, man, I really appreciate it. Make sure to support your stuff, and thanks for coming on, Chris.
Thank you.
Of course. Thank you so much to Rob for giving us an hour of his time. I never know sometimes with the stuff I put out how people are going to receive it, or how popular it's going to be. I try not to play favorites. That's far and away one of my favorite interviews that we've done. Just because that I could have sat there and talked baseball for 8 hours with the guy. Really sharp mind. I love talking pitching, and just a nice, just a really, really cool guy to talk to. One of those guys that you're very happy to see that he's become successful. And I also love his story. We probably didn't dive into that as much as I would have liked to, but I love those stories about guys who were, I was doing this thing. I was trying to be a lawyer. I was an IT guy. I was this, and, ends up growing and becoming a successful content creator. It is not an easy grind, but I'm happy to see that he's been successful and thriving. So continue to support all his stuff. The links to all his socials will be in the description for this video. Next week, we will continue with the baseball theme. Are you familiar with the Savannah Bananas? You're going to be, because one of the teams in the Savannah Bananas League is the Party Animals, and we have a viral star, Noah Fisher, who will be joining the program next week. We'll be doing an interview with him, kind of talking about that very insane world that is Banana Land baseball. I feel like it's become one of those things that started as kind of an underground following, but I don't know. You look at the numbers that this guy's got on TikTok, it ain't really an underground following anymore. And then we are starting to schedule guests out beyond that, but I just want to keep it once a week at this point. We're starting to, and I don't want to give away who the guests are, but I just want to say this will be a more diverse show in terms of the topics. Of course, sports will always be a primary topic here, but to me, if you want all the takes on Michigan/Detroit based sports, I'll say this is going to be for that. What Chris and company is, yes, there's going to be baseball interviews. I love doing those. There's going to be sports interviews. But my whole thing from the beginning is I want to talk to people that I find interesting, regardless of status, regardless of what their profession is. And so we will be doing that. And, hopefully you guys can continue to be receptive. I appreciate the support that we've gotten as Austin and I continue to try to grow this thing independently. But that will do it for today's episode. Like us on Apple Podcasts, subscribe on YouTube, on Spotify, find me on X or Twitter. I guess it's X now. I don't know. I think X might be better for the algorithm to refer to it as X because Elon Musk is watching over me. So Castellani 2014. Also in the link to or in the description for this, I will link to Austin's YouTube page as well, where he puts together some really badass edits. We'll be back at it next week with another episode. Stay tuned for I'll Say This as well. Love you guys more than anything. Have a great rest of your day. Peace and happiness.
It's an unfair game. We got to think differently.